This is the urbanist myth that just won't die. The one very mistaken idea about housing and density, held by a lot of well-meaning urbanists who we agree with on most other topics. We're talking about the belief that roughly 5 stories maximum is a universal optimal or ideal building height. This idea comes in large part from Danish designer and architect Jan Gehl, voted the second most influential urbanist in modern history, after Jane Jacobs. In his book, Cities for People, he argued that taller buildings are out of scale with the human experience. Above the 5th floor, offices and housing should logically be the province of the air traffic authorities. They no longer belong to the city, he claims. It's legitimately astonishing to see such an influential figure issue this bold of a dismissal of such a broad category of structure. Anything above 5 stories no longer belongs to the city? Really? Really?
This comes from section 2.1 of his book, where he says that the natural starting point for city design should be human senses. Our sight and hearing work best at shorter distances, especially when interacting with other people. 100 meters is the maximum for spectator events like concerts and sports, while personalized interactions start to become possible at 25 meters, reaching their highest quality below 7 meters. Humans also have a horizontal sensory apparatus, which means that our sight evolved to look straight ahead and to the side. We're less inclined to look down and much less inclined to look up. Put this all together and you have this chart showing that the ideal height for ground-to-building human interactions is up to 3 stories high. From the 3rd floor, you can easily talk to someone on the ground and have a quality interaction. This works okay up to 5 floors, but above that, contact with the city quickly dissipates, and you start to be in the realm of views, clouds, and airplanes. Above 5 stories, you are no longer taking part in the life of the city, according to this influential urbanist. Details cannot be seen, people on the ground can neither be recognized nor contacted.
We have an interesting perspective on this because our city meets this ideal pretty much perfectly. A typical Montreal street is lined by 3-story walk-up apartments with abundant balconies and staircases that provide exactly the kind of interaction between buildings and the street that he praises. And you know what? Yeah, it's kinda cool. It's nice to be able to sit outside on your balcony and do work or listen to a podcast while seeing people go by. It's nice to be able to see your friends if you're out and they happen to walk by, or greet them from the balcony if they come to visit. But if we're being honest, even in the summer, it's not like you walk down the street and everyone's out there chatting to each other from their balconies. It's something you see here and there. Some people do it more than others. Most people don't do it in the winter. And it doesn't strike us as so common or critical to city life that being able to talk to people from your balcony or window should fundamentally define what buildings are good and acceptable.
This section is presented to come across as scientific or objective, referencing the angles and distances of human senses and perception. People can read it and tell others, did you know it's been determined that 5 stories maximum is the ideal building height? But it's based on a subjective choice of what to value. Who decided that being able to talk to someone from your balcony is goal number 1 in housing? An urban designer whose job it is to design lively and social public spaces. And that's not a bad goal. It's just not the only goal we care about. For example, taller buildings near transit allow more people access to cheap and sustainable transportation. If you're an urbanist who likes shorter buildings, would you pick this short building further from transit over this tall building closer to transit? Maybe, maybe not. But you should be able to see it's a trade-off with no right answer. Being able to talk to someone from your balcony or window is not objectively more important than living closer to transit. And if your answer is, we should all live in short buildings immediately adjacent to metro stations, that's not how geometry works.
To be fair to Jan Gehl, he doesn't actually go as far as saying that taller buildings should never exist, but he does present them as an aberration from the ideal that he defined from his sensory social first principles, and we think that's a mistake. Our starting point for density is that buildings should be as tall as they need to be in order to provide abundant housing in places that people want to live. That means a sane housing market where supply is elastic and responsive to demand, where it's easy to live close to transit, or your job, or your friends and family if you want, where renters don't have to compete with each other for apartments, where owning a home is within reach of most families. where homelessness is not common, and where social and co-op housing are accessible with short waitlists. In cities that are smaller or have less demand, housing abundance might be achieved by 3-story buildings. In bigger or higher demand cities, the equivalent might be 30-story buildings. There's a major tension here between urban design and urban economics. As an architect and urban designer, Jan Gehl seems to be treating density or height as something you can find an optimal value for, based on careful theorizing and design principles. But from the perspective of urban economics, density or height is a functional question. How much floor space do you get from a particular amount of land? Taller buildings provide more housing, all else equal, and there's no optimal amount of housing for a city any more than there's an optimal number of lines for a subway system. It depends on the city's needs. Imagine if someone said, the optimal subway network has no more than 5 lines. Beyond that, contact with the city quickly dissipates, and people spend too much time in the subterranean realm of rocks and worms.
Sometimes it feels like design-focused urbanism treats cities like paintings where you can just place elements according to an artistic vision without having to care about how they function. He identifies Greenwich Village and Soho as better than other denser parts of Manhattan. Having fewer floors and more attractive city space provides considerably more life than the high-density, high-rise areas where many more people live and work. Reasonable density and good quality city space are almost always preferable to areas with higher density. Preferable in what sense, though? As an urban designer, he focuses on it being livelier and more pleasant, in his view. Okay. But the lower density here is partly a result of downzonings and historic preservation, making it difficult to build newer, taller buildings despite demand for more housing clearly existing here. From an urban economics perspective, do these policies have downsides? Do they contribute to the city's housing shortage and push people out to have longer commutes? Do they contribute to high rents and a median income double the citywide average? The median rent in Greenwich Village looks to be well over $5,000. Is that a success? He doesn't address any of this. To be clear, we're not saying this urban form is inherently bad. Aesthetically, we agree it's nice. But that doesn't mean it meets the housing needs of Manhattan, one of the biggest job centers in the entire world. For an analogy, the Copenhagen metro is pretty nice, for the size of Copenhagen, but it wouldn't be anywhere near sufficient to cover New York City. New York could borrow some concepts, like automated trains, but the scale of the system just isn't sufficient.
Density and height aren't actually the main focus of the book. He only dedicates a dozen or so pages to these topics. His core idea of human-scale design is actually pretty useful in a lot of contexts. For example, in explaining why the pedestrian experience can be so bad in big modernist plazas or car-centric environments. He talks about how fine-grained detail at eye level is important for the pedestrian experience, and we wholeheartedly agree. It's why we like walking around Montreal's residential neighborhoods so much. And we can recognize that a lot of taller buildings have failed to create a nice pedestrian environment, but we don't think that's inherent to height, because you can also find a lot of shorter buildings with dead space and uninteresting streetscapes. It's entirely possible to design a taller building with shops, residences, details, and a life at street level. Ground floor retail has been a thing for a long time, and we personally like the type of high-rise that stylistically has townhouses or low-rise apartments on the bottom. Jan Gehl even mentions in a later interview that the Empire State Building is an example of height not necessarily being that important, because it meets the street in a friendly way. This video is not meant to dismiss the benefits of good architecture and design. We just think the first job of a city is to meet the needs of its residents, current and future, and that means abundant and accessible housing is close to priority number 1. The job of urban designers and architects, in our view, is not to dictate housing quantity from design principles. It's to translate the housing quantity and heights that we need into a good urban environment.
This video isn't meant as a takedown of Jan Gehl, or even a negative review of the book. He's obviously very accomplished, and most of the book is pretty good. We just think that architecture and urban design fundamentally need to be grounded in the realities of urban economics. If you go too far into the design side without a grounding in the fundamentals, you end up with arbitrary and kind of kooky proclamations about tall buildings being bad because they put you closer to birds than people. And as one of the most influential urbanists in the world, people listen when he says things like this, even if he's less dogmatic about it when you press him on it. You can see his influence anywhere from mayoral hopefuls in Toronto referring to towers as vertical sprawl and saying that, once you go above 10 floors, you have more in common with birds and planes than with other people, to commenters on our channel saying, big towers are garbage, and Jan Gehl proved they are garbage. But he didn't. You can't read the explanation in this book and seriously argue that it was a scientific process or an objective conclusion. It's a stylistic or lifestyle preference, and it doesn't capture the full range of needs and preferences that people have, or the trade-offs that exist in real life.
If you're looking to balance out Jan Gehl, we'd recommend the book Order Without Design by Alain Berthaud as an introduction to urban economics that gives a better understanding of cities as complex systems that actually need to function and meet people's needs for housing and transportation. Thanks for watching through to the end of the video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and a special thanks to our supporters on Patreon.